The first suitcase did not look like the beginning of a murder case. It looked like something the water had carried in, a piece of luggage near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel. Then another. Then another. 3 matching suitcases found on different days, holding the evidence of a life that had been broken apart and hidden from home. This is the McGuire case, and the most important question is not only how Bill McGuire died, it is why the story around his disappearance had to travel so far before it came back to a Woodbridge apartment, a new house, a gun purchase, computer searches, garbage bags, and a courtroom that would spend weeks turning ordinary objects into evidence. Bill McGuire was a husband and father. In April 2004, he and Melanie were closing on the first home they would own together. That detail matters because the case begins at a moment that should have meant stability. A family buying a house, a future being organized, a normal life moving into a new address. On the 28th of April 2004, after the closing, Bill made calls connected to the new house. The appellate record later noted a call to transfer gas service and calls to friends where he sounded happy about the purchase. After that evening, the record says there was no evidence that Bill spoke to anyone again after about 6:10 p.m., other than perhaps Melanie. That silence is one of the first alarms in the case. Bill was not someone whose phones usually went cold. He used his phones and BlackBerry for work and social contact. A sudden break in that pattern mattered because the first version of a disappearance often depends on what people were already expected to do. Melanie's account placed the rupture inside the marriage. She said, Bill had argued with her in the early morning hours of the 29th of April that he had struck her, and that he left after saying she would never see him again. In the first version, Bill was not dead. He was angry. He was gone. Had left the family, the job, the new house, and the responsibilities that came with all of them. That version had emotional force. It gave an answer before there was evidence of a body. It made Bill the person who disappeared himself. It made Melanie the person left behind. And in many cases, a story like that can hold for a while because it fits a familiar pattern. Domestic conflict, a sudden exit, a spouse who may not want to be found. But timelines are not built from emotional force. They are built from calls, cars, receipts, toll records, surveillance, witness statements, computer activity, purchase records, and all the small details that refuse to stay quiet. The car became one of those details. Bill's Zyxu Maxima was eventually found in Atlantic City. Melanie later gave explanations for why she had gone there and moved the vehicle. The appellate record describes a complicated story involving Atlantic City, a motel parking lot, a cab ride, and later searches for Bill. It was the kind of explanation that asked investigators to accept several unusual movements at once. The problem with a complicated explanation is that every extra step creates another place where the record can push back. Cab records can be checked. Surveillance can be reviewed. Phone activity can be compared. The more a story depends on unusual travel and unusual timing, the more it has to survive ordinary paperwork. The case then moved from disappearance to discovery. Between May 5 and May 16, 2004, 3 suitcases were found in the water near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel in Virginia. I see them were the remains of Bill McGuire. The medical and forensic details were terrible, but a respectful retelling does not need to dwell on them. What matters for the story is the structure. The remains had been packaged, transported, and separated from the place where Bill had last been known to be alive. The discovery changed everything. A vanished husband could still be argued over as a runaway, a hidden person, a man who left, or a person caught in some unknown danger. The suitcases ended that uncertainty. Bill had not simply walked away from his life. Someone had killed him, concealed him, and moved the evidence far from New Jersey. That distance gave the case its first visual shock. New Jersey apartment, new house, Atlantic City car, Virginia water, 3 suitcases. The geography looked scattered, but investigators had to ask whether the scattered geography was the point. If evidence is moved far enough away, maybe the first story has more room to survive. In October 2004, New Jersey authorities took over the murder investigation. By June 2005, Melanie McGuire was arrested and charged. The timeline is important because it shows the case did not turn on a single dramatic clue. It turned on an accumulation of evidence across many categories. The appellate opinion later listed the broad evidence collected. Medical examiner reports, witness interviews, Melani's statements, business records, phone and pharmacy records, surveillance tapes, gun shop records, forensic evaluations, computer analysis, handwriting and linguistic analysis, recorded conversations, and wiretaps. The state did not claim to have an eyewitness to the killing. It built a circumstantial case, and the power of that case depended on how the pieces fit. Circumstantial evidence can be misunderstood by viewers. It does not mean weak evidence. It means evidence that proves a fact through surrounding facts. A receipt is circumstantial. A search history is circumstantial. A car found in the wrong place is circumstantial. A missing weapon is circumstantial. But if enough independent facts point in the same direction, the case can become extremely strong. The prosecution's theory began with motive and pressure. Bill and Melanie had just closed on a house, but the marriage was not the only relationship in Mullen's life. The state presented evidence of an affair with Dr. Bradley Miller, a physician in the practice where Mullen worked. The relationship, the new home, the cost of divorce, and questions about the future all became part of the state's picture of motive. Motive is not proof by itself. It can explain why someone might want an outcome, but it cannot prove who created that outcome. The prosecution still had to connect motive to action. That is where the physical and digital evidence became central. One thread involved computer searches. A state police computer expert testified about searches on the McGuire's home computer in April 2004. The topics included gun laws, poisons, sedatives, and other terms that prosecutors argued were consistent with planning. The search for chloral hydrate stood out because the drug was later found in Bill's car. Computer searches are powerful because they place private curiosity into a timeline. A person can explain a single search in many ways, but a cluster of searches placed before a disappearance creates a different kind of pressure. The question becomes not only what was searched, but when, by whom, and how that activity fits beside later events. Another thread involved the gun. On the 26th of April 2004, 2 days before Bill disappeared, Melanie bought a Taurus .38 caliber revolver at a gun shop in Pennsylvania. The gun itself was never found. The state connected the purchase to testimony about gun while conversations and to the bullets recovered from Bill's body. The forensic testimony did not say the bullets could only have come from that one weapon, but it placed the purchase inside the same narrow window as the disappearance. That timing is what gives the gun evidence weight. A handgun bought 2 days before a spouse vanishes is not just a purchase. It becomes part of a sequence, a new house, a hidden conflict. Internet searches of firearm, a sudden disappearance, a story about a husband leaving a car in Atlantic City, Suitcases in Virginia. The defense had to attack that sequence. In a case without an eyewitness, the defense strategy had obvious targets: gaps, assumptions, forensic uncertainty, alternative possibilities, and the state's inability to place every physical act directly in front of the jury. The defense could say the gun was not recovered, the apartment did not show the kind of trace evidence one might expect, and the state was asking jurors to connect too much from circumstances. Those arguments mattered. They also explain why the trial was so long. In 2007, the prosecution called dozens of witnesses, the defense called additional witnesses. Many expert witnesses testified, and hundreds of exhibits were admitted. This was not a simple courtroom story. It was a dense evidence case. One of the most contested pieces involved garbage bags. The state argued that bags found with the suitcases could be compared to bags connected to the McGuire apartment. Expert testimony about plastic bags may sound uncinematic, but in this case it was important enough to become a major issue on appeal. The defense challenged the admission and reliability of that expert testimony, and the appellate opinion spent time discussing why the trial court allowed it. That is the kind of detail that makes the case feel real. Not a chase, not a confession scene. A plastic garbage bag examined under expert standards, argued over by lawyers, and presented to juries as one more link between home and water. The visual lesson is clear. Ordinary objects can become witnesses. A suitcase is just luggage until it carries evidence. A garbage bag is just plastic until its manufacturing marks and characteristics enter a courtroom. A receipt is just paper until it lands 2 days before a disappearance. A search term is just typed text until it sits beside a body, a missing weapon, and a contested timeline. Another thread involved the domestic violence restraining order. After Bill disappeared, Melanie went to court and sought legal protection. The state argued that some of her actions after the disappearance were part of an effort to create the appearance that Bill had left after a violent argument. The defense viewed the situation differently. But the key point for the audience is that post-disappearance behavior became evidence because it shaped the first public story. That first story was that Bill left. If Bill left, then the new house, the marriage conflict, and the missing car could be explained as pieces of domestic chaos. If Bill did not leave, if he was already dead, then those same pieces look entirely different. A restraining order application, an Atlantic City trip, statements to friends, and comments to police become part of an alleged cover story. This is why the case has suspense even though the legal result is known. The suspense is not whether a suitcase will be found. The suspense is how long the first explanation can survive. By the time the case reached trial, prosecutors were asking jurors to see a pattern. planning before the 28th of April, a killing after the house, closing, disposal, and concealment over the next days, and a story designed to make Bill look like the one who chose to vanish. The defense pushed back against that pattern. Melanie McGuire maintained her innocence. Her lawyers argued the state had not proved its theory beyond a reasonable doubt. They challenged the scientific evidence, the inferences, and the gaps. They pointed to the lack of direct evidence inside the apartment. They questioned the state's theory about the disposal. They argued that the jury should not convict on speculation. That is the courtroom tension. The state says the pattern is too strong to be coincidence. The defense says the pattern is being forced onto uncertain facts. The jury heard the evidence during February through April 2007. After weeks of testimony and several days of deliberation, the jury convicted Melanie on the charges in the first indictment. First, Duggar murder, possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose, desecration of human remains, and perjury. The jury acquitted her on charges connected to anonymous communications. That split matters because it shows the jury was not simply accepting everything the state offered. They separated counts. They convicted on the core murder-related charges and rejected other allegations. For a viewer, that makes the legal outcome more important, not less. It suggests the jury was weighing categories rather than rubber stamping every theory. At sentencing, Melanie received life in prison plus 5 years under the No Relaciones Act. The murder sentence carried decades before parole eligibility. The appellate opinion states that she must serve at least 66 years before she can be considered for parole. Then came the appeal. Appeals are not race trails. They do not ask a new jury to decide guilt from the beginning. They ask whether legal errors affected the trial or sentence. Moline's appeal raised many issues: jury taint, publicity, juror handling, prosecutorial misconduct, evidentiary rulings, expert testimony, exclusions of defense evidence, and sentencing arguments. The appellate court reviewed the record and affirmed the verdict and sentence in 2011. The 2011 decision is the legal spine of this episode. It does not mean every public argument disappeared. It means the appellate court upheld the conviction and sentence after reviewing the claims. For a true crime script, that distinction matters. We can describe the prosecution theory, the defense challenges, and the affirmed result without pretending the public debate is the same thing as legal uncertainty. The New Jersey Attorney General's office announced the appellate result the same day. The public statement said the panel rejected arguments for reversal. That is why the case's current legal posture is straightforward. Melanie McGuire remains convicted, her sentence was affirmed, and recent coverage continues to describe her as serving a life sentence. Recent reporting has revisited the case because it has the ingredients that make a true crime story hard to forget. A new house, a marriage under pressure, an affair, a missing husband, a car found in Atlantic City, suitcases in the Bay, a gun purchase, computer searches, and years of appeals. But those ingredients should not make the script sensational, they should make it precise. The precision starts with Bill. Bill McGuire can become almost invisible in retellings because the evidence is so strange. The suitcases, the gun, the searches, the courtroom disputes, and the nickname attached to the case can pull attention away from the person who was killed. But the case begins with a man who called friends about a new house and then stopped communicating. That is a human anchor: a father, a husband, a person with work routines, phone habits, and people who expected to hear from him. The moment his ordinary communication stopped, the clock began. The second anchor is the house closing. It is important because it placed everyone at a threshold. The family had just made a major financial and emotional move. A new home can symbolize commitment. In the prosecution's theory, that same commitment intensified the pressure because Melanie wanted a different life. That contrast gives the case its unease. The appearance of a new beginning beside the prosecution's claim of a planned ending. The third anchor is Atlantic City. Bill's car did not simply disappear forever. It was found. The explanation for how it got there became part of the state's case. Cars are difficult evidence because they connect geography, timing, and behavior. They can hold forensic clues, but even without a dramatic discovery inside where a car appears can contradict where a story says a person should be. The fourth anchor is the bay. It is visually powerful, but it should be used with restraint. Water hides and reveals. The suitcases were supposed to separate the evidence from the original scene. Instead, the bay returned them to the record. Each discovery narrowed the distance between a missing person story and a homicide case. The fifth anchor is the apartment. The state did not find the kind of trace evidence that would make the physical scene simple. That absence became part of the defense argument. But absence does not automatically prove innocence, just as a single suspicious detail does not automatically prove guilt. The trial was about the total evidence, and the appellate court reviewed that total record. The sixth anchor is the computer. Search histories can feel almost too neat in a modern crime story, but they are not magic. They need authentication, timing, context, and interpretation. In this case, the state used computer evidence as part of a larger pattern. The searches did not stand alone. They were placed beside the gun purchase, the disappearance, the drug evidence, and the state's theory of planning. The seventh anchor is the garbage bag evidence. It sounds small until it becomes a courtroom fight. That is the kind of evidence that rewards a slower narration. Show the viewer a shelf of ordinary supplies. Show a forensic lab. Show an expert explaining why plastic folds manufacture and comparison can matter. Then show the defense challenging whether that testimony should have been admitted. That is suspense built from process, not shock. The eighth anchor is the appeal. Many true crime videos stop at the verdict, but this case did not. The appellate record explains what was thought after the jury left. It also protects the script from becoming only a retelling of the state's version. The defense arguments existed. They were reviewed. The conviction was affirmed. That is the legal shape. One reason the case holds attention is that McGuire has continued to deny guilt in public interviews. That denial creates ongoing viewer tension, but it does not erase the conviction. The right wording is simple. She was convicted, she maintains innocence, and the conviction and sentence have been affirmed. That wording avoids turning a legal result into a debate show while still acknowledging the continuing public posture. The episode's emotional rhythm should move like the investigation did. Normal life, sudden silence, first explanation, distant discovery, narrowing evidence, trial pressure, appeal result, present status. Normal life matters because without it the case becomes only a spectacle. Bill's last known evening came after a house closing. That is ordinary and specific. It is not a haunted setting. It is paperwork, utilities, phone calls, people saying they bought a house. The more ordinary the beginning, the more disturbing the silence becomes. The sudden silence matters because it is the first contradiction. Bill's phones and work life made his disappearance hard to accept as casual. When a person who communicates suddenly stops, the absence itself becomes evidence. The first explanation matters because it shows what the suspect story wanted the world to believe. A violent argument, a husband leaving a car, turning up elsewhere, a family crisis that could explain chaos. The case becomes susceptible when that explanation starts requiring too much coincidence. The distant discovery matters because it changes the category. Missing becomes murdered. Domestic confusion becomes concealment. A local disappearance becomes an interstate evidence problem. 3 suitcases in Virginia pulled the case into a larger mount. The narrowing evidence matters because each object becomes part of a chain. The gun purchase does not stand alone. The search history does not stand alone. The Atlantic City car does not stand alone. The garbage bags do not stand alone. Each one gains force when placed beside the others. The trial pressure matters because jurors had to decide whether the chain proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They did not see a simple eyewitness account. They heard weeks of testimony and had to decide whether the state's pattern overcame the defense attacks. The appeal result matters because it tells the viewer what happened after conviction. The defense did not stop at the jury. The legal fight continued and the appellate court affirmed. That is a clean point in a case that otherwise contains many contested details. The present status matters because the case is still part of public memory. Mine articles and television pieces return to it, and Melanie remains known as a woman convicted in the so-called suitcase murder. But the script should avoid letting a nickname replace the record. A nickname is marketable. The record is what keeps the story honest. The strongest visual language for this episode is not graphic. It is investigative. Dark water under bridge lights, evidence lockers, a suitcase on a forensic table, a phone beside a utility bill, a dim apartment hallway, a gun shop receipt without readable real text, a lab bench with black plastic bags, a courthouse at night, a quiet new house exterior with no people in frame. The audience does not need real crime scene images to feel suspense. They need alignment. During the house closing section, show paperwork or a dark suburban exterior. During Bill's phone silence, show a phone and a dim desk. For Atlantic City, use a modal parking lot and a car silhouette. For the Bay, use water and a bridge at night. For the garbage bag evidence, use forensic comparison without gore. For court, use an empty courtroom, appeals documents, and a courthouse exterior. That alignment matters because weak true crime videos often treat visual as decoration. This episode cannot do that. The pictures need to carry the evidence path. They should help the viewer feel the timeline tightening. The sound should also stay controlled. The story is already heavy. A male English narration can carry it with a steady, low rhythm. The pace should rise around the discovery of the suitcases and the stacking of evidence, then slow down for the appeal and final posture. Suspense does not mean shouting. It means making the next fact feel unavoidable. There's also a quieter courtroom idea that should stay in the narration. Absence can be argued both ways. The defense can point to missing direct proof and ask jurors not to fill gaps with suspicion. The prosecution can point to the pattern and argue that the missing pieces are exactly what concealment was designed to create. The audience needs to understand that tension because it is the heart of a circumstantial case. The prosecution did not have to show jurors a perfect movie of the crime. It had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt through the record. That meant asking jurors to hold many details in their heads at once. Bill's last communications, the timing of the house purchase, the gun bought shortly before the disappearance, the computer searches, the car in Atlantic City, the suitcases found in Virginia, the forensic testimony, and Melanie statements after Bill was gone. The defense did not have to solve the murder for someone else. It had to create reasonable doubt about the state's chain. That meant attacking how each link was interpreted. Was a search term proof of planning or explainable curiosity? Was a purchase suspicious or legally ordinary? Did the garbage bag evidence reliably connect the apartment to the suitcases? Did the state's timeline ask for too much certainty from imperfect facts? Those questions make the trial more interesting than a simple villain story. They show why the jury's task was difficult. Jurors had to decide whether the state had crossed the legal line from suspicion to proof. The final verdict says they believed it had. The appeal says the reviewing court found no reversible error that required undoing that result. For pacing, this section should feel like a tightening net. Set with one object, add a second, add a third. Let each fact change how the previous fact feels. The gun purchase carries more weight once the disappearance is known. The searches become harder to dismiss beside the medical testimony. The Atlantic City car gains pressure when the first story begins to strain. The garbage bags take on force after the suitcases connect the apartment question to the bay. By the time the viewer reaches sentencing, the point should be clear. This was not a case won by one spectacular reveal. It was a case won by accumulation. That is often how real prosecutions work. They do not always end with a single dramatic confession. They end with a jury looking at many ordinary records and deciding the ordinary records have become extraordinary together. In the final act, return to the first suitcase. At the start, it looked like something the water brought in. By the end, it is no longer just luggage. It is the object that broke the first story. It forced a missing person case to become a murder case. It brought Virginia water back to a New Jersey apartment. It made investigators ask who had the motive, the time, the means, and the ability to create a story that made Bill look gone by choice. The court's answer was Melanie McGuire. The jury convicted her in 2007. The appellate court affirmed in 2011. She has continued to maintain innocence, but the legal record remains the record. Life in prison, decades before parole eligibility, and a conviction that survived appeal. The case is remembered because the concealment was as shocking as the killing, but the deeper reason is simpler. It begins with a family buying a house. It ends with the law reading ordinary objects as evidence. A car, a phone, a receipt, a computer, a bag, a suitcase, and a timeline that would not hold the story it was given. That is why the McGuire case still works as a long-form episode. It is not only a headline about 3 suitcases, it is a lesson in how a first explanation can sound human, even sympathetic, until the record keeps applying pressure and the explanation breaks under the weight of its own details.